All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving into a story that's, well, it's a real head-scratcher.
It's a case that really gets to the heart of, well, human nature, the lengths people will go to.
We're talking about Continental Airlines Flight 11, 1962. Picture it. The jet age, everyone's excited about flying, and this flight, Chicago to Kansas City, 45 souls on board, families going on trips, businessmen, you name it.
And at the helm, a seasoned captain, the kind of guy you'd feel safe with, and a young flight engineer just starting out.
Seems like an ordinary flight, right? Kick,
Yeah.
hop. But it ended in a way nobody could have predicted.
Yeah, tragedy. And the story behind it, well, it's stranger than fiction. Really is.
So let's unpack this, shall we? Paint a picture for our listeners. What exactly happened to Flight 11?
So the flight takes off, no problem, smooth sailing, And then at 9:17 p.m., bam, a huge explosion rips through the rear lavatory.
The lavatory, you're kidding?
Nope. Tears the tail section right off the
Yeah.
plane. Imagine the chaos on board, the terror.
Oh, man. I can't even fathom it. Sudden decompression, the plane probably went into a nosedive.
Absolutely. And the engines, they tear away, the plane's falling completely out of control. Witnesses on the ground, they reported seeing a bright flash, hearing these strange noises like a roar, then silence.
I read that a B-47 bomber crew actually saw the flash, too. They were flying nearby.
That's right. A chilling sight from up there, I bet.
So what happened next? Did anyone survive?
Well, the plane went down near Unionville, Missouri. Wreckage was scattered for miles. It was a devastating scene. Sadly, 44 people died instantly at the crash site. One more passed away shortly after.
It's heartbreaking. A whole plane full of people gone in an instant. So how did investigators even begin to piece together what happened?
Right, so they had this massive debris field, right? Pieces of the plane everywhere, but they were meticulous. They studied the wreckage, analyzed the damage, trying to figure out where the explosion
How
originated.
did they find?
Well, all signs pointed to the lavatory. That's where the explosion started. But here's the thing. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't like a faulty pipe or anything.
What, you saying this wasn't an accident?
That's where the FBI comes in. They take over the investigation, and it's like something straight out of a detective novel. They start digging into the passenger manifest, interviewing witnesses, trying to find anything out of the ordinary.
And they did.
Find something. They zeroed in on one passenger, Thomas G. Doty. He was a last-minute addition to the flight list. Seemed like an ordinary guy, but, well, he had a past.
A past, like what?
Legal troubles, financial strain. The guy was drowning in debt, and here's where it gets really interesting. Right before the flight, Doty buys a massive life insurance policy, like $150,000 worth.
Wow, that's a lot of money, especially back then.
The maximum allowed at the time, and get this, he even buys additional coverage at the airport.
So he stood to make a huge amount of money if he died during the flight. Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. But come on, the risk. Wouldn't it be obvious he was behind it?
That's what baffled investigators. It seems like Doty was desperate, convinced he could pull off this insane scheme.
He really thought he could get away with it.
The theory is he planned to detonate explosives in the lavatory. He figured, accident, plane goes down, family collects the insurance.
He brought explosives like bombs onto a plane. How in the world did he get past security?
Remember, this was 1962. Airport security was, well, practically non-existent compared to today.
Yeah.
No metal detectors, no x-ray machines, no TSA pat-downs. It was a different world.
You're telling me he could just waltz onto a plane with dynamite in his pocket?
Pretty much. It's mind-boggling to think about now. But back then, the idea of someone intentionally bringing down a plane, it was almost inconceivable.
So they believe Doty really did blow up the plane, killing everyone on board, including himself, all for the insurance money.
That's the FBI's conclusion. 6 sticks of dynamite snuck onto the plane in his briefcase, detonated in the lavatory. A chilling level of premeditation.
And his family, did they ever receive the payout?
No. Doty's death was ruled a suicide, and that voided the policy. His family didn't get a dime. All those lives lost, and for nothing.
It's unbelievable. It makes you wonder, was this some kind of bizarre one-off event? Or were there others trying to do the same thing, cash in on insurance by bringing down planes?
Sadly, no. It wasn't unique. This case kind of blew the lid off a chilling trend that was emerging. Air travel becoming a target for insurance fraud.
Seriously, so this wasn't an isolated incident?
There were other attempts, some successful, some not. Like in 1959, you had National Airlines Flight 967 vanished over the Gulf of Mexico. They never found the wreckage. Still a mystery, officially, but many believe it was another insurance bombing.
And there were more.
Yeah, and just a year later, National Airlines Flight 2511, that one was targeted too. Someone tried to pull off a similar scheme.
It's terrifying. You think about the so-called golden age of flying. It's all glamorous, but behind the scenes, there's this dark undercurrent, people plotting to blow up planes for money.
It certainly shatters that romanticized image, doesn't it? But it highlights something crucial. We often focus on technology, the advancements, but even then, human greed, desperation, they find a way to exploit the weaknesses.
So how could something like this even happen? Was it just a matter of lax security?
Partly, it was the dawn of commercial jet travel. The idea of searching everyone, their bags, it was, well, people weren't comfortable with that back then.
It seems so obvious now, though.
Hindsight is 20/20, right? This event, it exposed a huge flaw in the system, a vulnerability no one had really considered.
This whole story it's fascinating and incredibly disturbing. I mean, we just hop on planes now without a second thought. But back then, it was the Wild West.
It was a different world. And this tragedy, it really makes you appreciate how far we've come in terms of security.
This is all so thought-provoking. But before we get into all that, I'm curious, are there any stories about people who were supposed to be on Flight 11, but something happened, they missed it?
Oh, absolutely. There's this one story, a family of 4. They were booked on the flight, but their connecting flight in Chicago was delayed. They missed Flight 11 by minutes. Can you imagine?
Wow. Talk about dodging a bullet.
The relief they must have felt, and then the weight of knowing how close they came. It gives me chills just thinking about it.
It really makes you think about all the lives touched by this event, even indirectly.
The ripple effects, yeah. And the story of Flight 11, it's captivated people for decades, Documentaries, books, even fiction. Arthur Haley, the guy who wrote Airport, that book was partially inspired by this.
So the tragedy became a part of our culture, our collective memory.
It serves as a reminder, doesn't it, about the fragility of life and the consequences of, well, unchecked greed. But it's also a story of resilience, the ongoing quest for safety and security.
Speaking of reminders, I understand there's a memorial dedicated to the victims of Flight 11.
Yeah, in Unionville, Missouri, near the crash site, it's a beautiful memorial, a tribute to the 45 lives lost, a place for quiet reflection.
A reminder of the human cost of this tragedy. So we've explored the details of the crash, the motive, the impact on aviation security, even its influence on popular culture. But there's still this big question hanging in the air. If Thomas Doty were alive today, in our world of TSA and high-tech security, could he pull it off? Could he have gotten away with this horrific scheme?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It really gets to the heart of how we balance security and freedom in our modern world.
Because on one hand, you want to prevent these kinds of tragedies at all costs, right?
Absolutely. But you also don't want to live in a society where everyone is constantly being watched and scrutinized and searched.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. So where do we go from here? What happened after Flight 11? How did it change the way we think about airport security?
Well, it was a process, a slow evolution. But Flight 11, it was a wake-up call. It forced the world to take a hard look at the vulnerabilities of air travel.
So what kind of changes did they make? Did they, start searching everyone's bags right away?
Well, not exactly right away, but it definitely started a shift in thinking. One of the first things they did was increase scrutiny of passengers, trying to identify potential threats.
Like profiling. That seems, I don't know, a little bit tricky.
Yeah, it was a delicate balance. But they started implementing more thorough background checks, especially for last-minute bookings, like duties, and they started paying closer attention to passenger behavior.
Behavior. Like what were they looking for?
Nervousness, inconsistencies in their stories, an unusual amount of luggage, anything that seemed off. Ticket agents and flight attendants, they were trained to look for these things.
So it wasn't just about catching weapons, it was about identifying people who might pose a threat.
Right. It was more about, human intelligence, relying on observation and intuition as much as technology.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the technology? I mean, when did things like metal detectors and X-ray machines come into play?
That took a bit longer. Those technologies were still pretty new back then, and there was a lot of debate about their effectiveness and cost.
I guess people were also pretty wary of being scanned and searched.
Yeah, the idea of personal privacy was a big deal. But as the threat of air terrorism became more real, and as the technology improved, the push for more advanced security measures gained momentum.
So when did we start seeing the kind of airport security that we're used to today? With the TSA and all the procedures we have now.
The real turning point came in the 1970s after a wave of hijackings. That's when metal detectors and X-ray machines became more widespread, and security procedures became a lot more standardized.
I imagine September 11th, 2001 was another major turning point.
Absolutely. 9/11 changed everything. It led to the creation of the TSA and a whole new level of security. Full body scanners, enhanced pat-downs, restrictions on liquids.
And the list goes on. It's amazing to think how much has changed in a relatively short period of time.
It's a constant evolution. We're always learning, adapting to new threats.
So back to our original question. Could Doty have pulled off his plan today?
It's hard to say for sure, but honestly, it's highly unlikely. The layers of security we have now, from passenger screening to baggage checks to behavioral analysis, make it extremely difficult to get anything dangerous onto a plane.
Plus, I bet the dynamite itself would set off all sorts of alarms.
Oh, yeah. Today's explosive detection technology is incredibly sophisticated. It can pick up even trace amounts of residue.
So in a way, the tragedy of Flight 11 and the lessons we learned from it have made air travel safer for all of us.
That's true. But, it's important to remember that no system is foolproof. There's always the potential for someone to find a way to exploit a weakness.
It's a constant cat and mouse game, right?
Exactly. And that's why we have to stay vigilant, constantly evaluating and improving our security measures.
This whole deep dive, it's been quite a journey. From the excitement of the jet age to the horror of the crash and then the ripple effects, the changes it set in motion, it really makes you think.
It does, doesn't it? It's a story that, while tragic, has so much to teach us about human nature, about our ingenuity and our vulnerability.
And about our ability to learn and adapt and make things better.
Which brings us back to that question of security versus freedom. It's a conversation that we need to keep having.
Because it's about finding that balance, isn't it? Creating a world where we can feel safe and secure without sacrificing our basic liberties.
Right. And as we navigate this increasingly complex world, that's a pretty important goal to keep in mind.
Okay, I have one last question, and it's a bit more speculative. We've talked a lot about how security measures have evolved since 1962, but what about the psychology of someone like Doty? Do you think someone with that kind of mindset, that willingness to sacrifice so many lives for their own gain, do you think that still exists today?
Sadly, I don't think we can rule that out. Human nature, it has a dark side, and greed and desperation, they can drive people to do terrible things.
But do you think the circumstances that led Doty to do what he did, are those still relevant today?
That's a tougher question. I mean, we live in a very different world now. Access to information, financial resources, it's all much more tightly controlled.
But people still face hardship, right? There's still economic inequality, stress, all the things that can push someone over the edge.
That's true, and that's why it's so important to be aware of those underlying issues, to address the root causes of violence and despair.
So while the specifics of Doty's case might seem like a relic of the past, the underlying motivations, they could still be present today.
Absolutely, and that's why we have to be vigilant on multiple levels, not just in terms of security, but also in terms of creating a more just and compassionate society.
It's a complex issue, for sure, but it's one that's worth thinking about.
Definitely, and it's a conversation that we need to keep having.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's a story that, while tragic, has a lot to teach us about ourselves and the world we live in.
I think we've squeezed about all the insights we can out of this topic for today.
Yeah, I think so. But I have a feeling this is a story that's going to stay with our listeners for a while.
I'm sure it will. It's a story that keeps raising questions about security and ethics and the darker side of human nature.
And it reminds us that even in our age of high tech, the human element, it's still the most important factor.
Well said. So, until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.
And never underestimate the power of a good story to make us think and to help us understand the world around us.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the story of Continental Airlines Flight 11.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and stay curious. Until next time. It's really striking how this one event, it happened so long ago, but it still fascinates people. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's the power of a good story, right? People are drawn to mysteries, to stories about, tragedy and resilience. And Flight 11, it definitely has all of that.
And the fact that it involves such a calculated act of evil, that just adds another level to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it forces us to look at that dark side of human nature, to ask ourselves, why would someone do such a thing? What could drive them to that?
But there's also this reminder that even in the face of something so awful, there's always hope. Hope for a safer world, for justice, for a future where these kinds of things don't happen anymore.
You said that beautifully. I think that's a really important message.
It is. But before we wrap up completely, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the memorial in Unionville, Missouri. What role do memorials like that play, in helping us understand these kinds of events?
Memorials are so important. They're a physical reminder of the lives lost, right? A place for people to gather, to remember, to grieve. But they're also something more than that.
What do you mean?
They're symbols, I think. Symbols of our resilience, our ability to come together after something terrible, and our determination to learn from the past.
So it's not just about remembering the tragedy, but about honoring the victims and acknowledging the impact they had.
Exactly. The memorial in Unionville, it's not just about the past, it's about the future, too. It's saying we will never forget, and also we'll keep working to make sure this never happens again.
That's powerful. As we've been talking about this case, one thing that keeps coming back to me is how Doty's plan, it was just futile in the end. He caused so much pain, so much suffering, but he didn't even achieve his goal.
It really shows how acts of evil, they often backfire. They might cause destruction, chaos, but they rarely achieve what they set out to do.
It's almost like there's I don't know, a cosmic justice at play. His greed and desperation led to his own downfall. He ended up with nothing.
And he left behind a legacy of pain and loss that people are still feeling today.
It's a sobering thought. But, like you said before, it's also a story of resilience and progress. We learned from this tragedy. We took steps to prevent it from happening again.
And that's crucial. The legacy of Flight 11, it's not just about the lives lost, but about those lessons and the measures we've taken to make air travel safer for everyone.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the story of Continental Airlines Flight 11, let's take a moment just to reflect on the lives lost, the lessons we've learned, and the ongoing quest for a safer world, a more secure world. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. We can learn from even the darkest moments in history. We can use those lessons to build a better future, to make sure tragedies like this are less likely to happen again. And we can honor the memory of those we lost by working towards a world that's safer, more just, more compassionate.
Beautifully put. And for all our listeners out there, stay curious, keep learning, and never ever take your safety for granted. Until next time.